When a crow looks at you, it is not just looking, it is calculating. There's a crow sitting on a fence near your house right now. It's not doing much, just sitting there, looking around. Maybe it glances at you for a second before looking away. You probably wouldn't think twice about it, but here's what's actually happening inside that small dark head. In the few seconds it looked at you, that crow processed your size, your posture, your walking speed, and whether your hands were empty or holding something. It compared what it saw to a mental catalog of every person it has seen in this location before. It made a decision about whether you were a threat, a non-event, or possibly a source of food. All of that in about 2 seconds, without you noticing any of it. We tend to think of intelligence as something that looks like us. Tools, language, cities, plans written down on paper. But there is another kind of mind on this planet. One that evolved in a completely different direction, with a brain built on a completely different architecture, and it has been quietly outperforming our expectations for decades. Today, we're going inside that mind. Not just what crows can do, but how they actually think, what they remember, what they plan for, and whether, when a crow looks at you, there's something looking back that's more aware of you than you ever imagined. Let's start with the obvious objection. A crow's brain weighs about 10 grams. A human brain weighs around 1,300 grams. That's not even close. For most of the last century, scientists assumed this meant crows simply couldn't be capable of complex thought. Brain size was treated as a measure that mattered. Then researchers started looking more closely at what's inside that small brain, and the assumption fell apart. Crows have an extraordinarily high density of neurons packed into their forebrain, specifically in a region called the nidopallium, which functions similarly to the human prefrontal cortex. Some studies have found that crows have a similar number of forebrain neurons to small primates, despite a brain a fraction of the size. It's not about how big the engine is, it's about how it's built. Here's an analogy that researchers sometimes use. Imagine two computers. One is large with a lot of components, but an older, less efficient architecture. The other is small, but every component is densely packed and optimized. The small one can outperform the large one, not despite its size, but in some ways because of how it's organized. Crow brains are the second computer, and what that compact, efficient brain produces is a set of cognitive abilities that, when first documented, made scientists genuinely doubt their own results. They reran the experiment. Multiple labs, multiple countries, multiple crow species. The results held. Crows could plan for the future, they could understand cause and effect, they could use tools, not just use them, but make them, customize them, and improve them. And in some specific tests, they outperformed children up to the age of 7. One of the most important questions in animal cognition is whether an animal can think about the future, not just react to the present, but actually plan for a moment that hasn't happened yet. For a long time, this was considered a uniquely human trait. Then researchers studying ravens, close cousins of crows, designed an experiment that changed that assumption entirely. The ravens were given a tool that could open a box containing food, but the box wasn't available yet. It would only appear later. The ravens had the option to either play with an immediate, lesser reward right away, or keep the tool and wait. The ravens kept the tool. They held onto an object that had no immediate use, anticipating a future situation where it would become valuable, and when that situation arrived, they used it correctly. In follow-up tests, ravens performed this kind of future planning at a level comparable to great apes, and in some versions of the test, better. Now think about your backyard crow. Crows are known to cache, hide food in dozens, sometimes hundreds of locations. And here's the part that matters. They remember where every single one is, not roughly, specifically. Even more remarkable, researchers have found that crows take into account whether they were being watched while hiding food. If another crow was observing, the crow would often return later, when alone, and move the food to a new hiding spot. That single behavior contains an enormous amount of thinking. It requires understanding that another individual has a perspective, that this other individual might remember what it saw, that this memory could be used against you later, and that the solution is to act now to prevent a future problem. That crow on your fence isn't just looking at the world as it is right now, it's thinking about what the world might be like later, and adjusting its behavior accordingly. There's a concept in psychology called theory of mind. It means understanding that other individuals have their own thoughts, knowledge, and perspectives, which might be different from your own. It's one of the most important cognitive milestones in human development. Children typically develop a basic theory of mind around age 4, the point where they'll understand that someone else might not know something they know. For decades, theory of mind was considered something close to uniquely human. Then researchers studying crows and ravens found behavior that was very difficult to explain any other way. In one set of experiments, researchers found that ravens, when hiding food, would change their behavior depending on whether they could be seen, even accounting for whether a peephole in a wall was open or closed, despite never having been trained on what a peephole was for. The ravens behaved as though they understood. If that opening is there, another bird might be able to see through it, and they adjusted accordingly. That's not just intelligence, that's modeling another mind. Now apply this to your backyard. When a crow watches you, it isn't just gathering information about your physical movements. There's reason to believe it's also factoring in something closer to, what does this human know? What is this human likely to do next, based on what I've seen them do before? Researchers studying crows in urban environments have observed that crows respond differently to people based on prior interactions. Not just recognizing a face, but seeming to factor in what that person is likely to do based on history. A person who has thrown food before is approached differently than a person who hasn't. A person who has thrown something at a crow before is avoided differently than a stranger, even years later, and even, in documented cases, by crows that weren't present for the original event but seem to have learned the association socially. When that crow looks at you, it isn't just seeing a shape, it's running a quiet prediction based on everything I know about creatures like you, and specifically about you, what happens next. In 2002, researchers at the University of Oxford were working with a crow named Betty. They gave her a task: retrieve a small food bucket from inside a vertical tube using a piece of straight wire. A straight wire is not useful for this task. You need a hook. Betty had never been trained to make hooks. She had never seen a hook used for this purpose before. She picked up the straight wire, wedged one end into a crack and bent it into a hook shape, then used it to lift the bucket out successfully. She did this on the first try. When researchers gave her new wire and removed the bent one, she made another hook, and another. Across multiple trials, she consistently solved the problem by creating a tool that did not exist until she made it. This kind of behavior has been documented again and again. Crows in the wild use sticks to extract insects from tree bark. Some populations have been observed using 3 different tools in sequence. A short stick to retrieve a medium stick, which is then used to retrieve a longer stick, which finally reaches the food. That's a multi-step plan, executed with objects toward a goal that's several steps away. In another set of experiments, inspired by an old fable about a crow dropping stones into a pitcher to raise the water level and reach a floating worm, researchers tested whether crows could actually do this. They could, and they did it efficiently, choosing larger stones over smaller ones when it mattered, and sinking floating objects rather than solid ones, understanding which actions would actually raise the water and which wouldn't. This wasn't trial and error. The crows largely got it right from very early attempts, suggesting they were reasoning about cause and effect, not just repeating random actions until something worked. We touched on this briefly, but it's worth dwelling on because the scale of it is genuinely hard to absorb. In a now famous study from the University of Washington, researchers wore distinct masks while trapping and briefly handling wild crows for tagging, a process the crows clearly experienced as threatening, even though they were released unharmed. From that point on, crows in the area reacted with alarm whenever they saw someone wearing one of those specific masks, scolding, group mobbing, following the wearer. This reaction was observed years later, and it spread beyond the crows that were originally involved to crows that hadn't been born yet at the time of the original trapping. Think about what that requires. An individual crow has to encode a specific visual pattern, a face as dangerous. It has to retain that information for years, and somehow, that information has to be transmitted to other crows, including young ones who never witnessed the original event. That's not a simple stimulus response reaction. That's something closer to an oral tradition, a piece of cultural knowledge passed from one generation to the next, built around the memory of a specific individual. And it doesn't only work in the negative direction. Crows that have been fed regularly by a specific person have been observed showing markedly different behavior toward that person compared to strangers, approaching more closely, showing less alarm, and in some documented cases, leaving small objects near that person's regular location. Whatever that behavior means exactly, and researchers are careful not to overinterpret it, it is, at minimum, evidence of a specific, individual, lasting relationship, formed and maintained inside a brain the size of a walnut. Here's what all of this adds up to. Somewhere in your neighborhood, there is a mind, small, dark-feathered, easy to overlook, that can plan for a future it hasn't seen yet. that can build tools to solve problems it has never encountered before, that can model what another creature might be thinking and adjust its own behavior accordingly, that can hold a memory of a specific individual for years and pass that memory on to others who never met that individual at all. It evolved all of this completely independently from us, a different branch of the tree of life entirely, separated from mammals for roughly 300 million years. No shared blueprint, no shared starting point, and yet, working with completely different materials, evolution arrived at something that looks, in many ways, remarkably similar to what we call intelligence. Maybe that's the most interesting part of all of this. Not that crows are smart, though they are, but that intelligence, real intelligence, capable of planning and reasoning and remembering and understanding others, isn't a single path that only we happen to walk. It's something the world seems to arrive at more than once, quietly, independently, in bodies the size of a cat, with brains the size of a walnut, sitting on fences, watching us go by. So the next time a crow looks at you, really looks, hold your gaze for a second longer than you expect. Consider that it might be doing exactly what you're doing, looking at something it doesn't fully understand, and quietly, carefully, trying to figure it out. If this changed the way you'll look at the crows in your own neighborhood, share it with someone who still thinks of them as just birds. And subscribe, because next time we look at what happens when a bird's memory of a person outlasts that person entirely, and what that means for the quiet relationships we don't even know we're part of